The narrative often set from the get-go when covering the Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram shock study, as we are looking at today, or any other dark science video that specifically delves into the psychological depths of humanity, is to first ask the question, what would you do? YouTubers do this for two reasons. The first being engagement on their videos, and the second is to achieve a mass thought experiment within their own comment sections. This is fine and this is valid. I have done this several times before myself. I take no issues with it. That said, however, this question lacks the situationalism, rather the nuance needed to immerse those who view their videos to really paint the mental picture needed for you to actually ascertain the desired level of understanding. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are covering the Milgram Obedience to Authority Shock Study, a decade older than the infamous Stanford prison experiment, but no less controversial, and certainly raises similar questions regarding ethics. The Milgram experiment, carried out by Stanley Milgram, was a study wherein the aim, using volunteer males to sit paired with other quote-unquote volunteers, one being the teacher and one being the learner. The teacher was to administer electric shocks, escalating in voltage, to the learner if they answered incorrectly to a word association game. The aim of this was to see just how far the teacher would go before questioning orders from the quote-unquote authority figure. The results of the test were, quite frankly, shocking, and no, that wasn't a pun. But before we get into the gritty details of this Yale-born experiment, let us first paint the aforementioned picture to get you properly acclimatized to what we are doing here. The Milgram shock study was the brainchild of Stanley Milgram, born in New York City during the 1930s to Jewish immigrant parents. Some years later, the world would bear witness to the horrors of the Holocaust. Stanley Milgram had become curious as he watched the despicable genocide unravel, and so the concept of obedience to authority was born. Stanley had heard the testimony of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust and lieutenant colonel in the SS. Eichmann stated he was simply following orders, and so Milgram wished to carry out a social psychology study to see if this mindset could be applied to other many atrocities in human history. Now, despite Eichmann being described as the banality of evil, this does beg the question, doesn't it? How many times have we heard this kind of excuse used in circumstances similar? The rise of Nazi Germany, the propaganda used to drive public sentiment into an anti-Jewish negative state, slowly justifying the persecution of the Jewish people, is in itself a rather unique situation. But it is not the first time in human history human beings were ordered by other human beings to carry out mass slaughter. Now, this is usually when you, the viewer, are asked, what would you do? The truth of the matter is that you likely do not know the answer to this question. Situationalism, your personality type, whether you have been conditioned to respect authority figures, whether you are able to justify obligation by the overarching mission, for example, quote-unquote, it's for science, and so on. So try to imagine this. You live in today's age. Modern, but climate issues, pollution, and resource scarcity is far worse than it is now. This is the world as set by the TV show Utopia. If you are going to go and watch that TV show, I recommend you watch the UK version, not the American Netflix version. Stay away from that reproduction. A shadowy organization approaches you. They tell you that a human child produces more carbon in the period it takes for he or she to grow up to an adult than X amount of cars, airplane rides, and so on. They tell you that in between 10 to 50 years' time, Earth will be engulfed in resource wars. Suffering, starving, and genocide are on the horizon, and they have found a way to reverse all of this. They have an airborne virus that will sterilize the human race. The virus's initial casualty numbers will be between 15 to 25,000 people worldwide. The sterilization will reduce population numbers enough over time that the human race will survive. We will go on. Not bad numbers, right? They want you to join them. They want you to unleash the virus upon the world. Now, take into consideration that 1. You were already aware through constant beating the drum via TV, the internet, and so on, things aren't looking that great. 2. You have also seen on TV various Western powers moving their militaries into locations that aren't particularly friendly. 3. This organization looks very professional, uses public figures from beyond the shadows to move their chess pieces around. So they look very official, have scientists in lab coats producing the bioweapon, and you actually see this. Men and women in suits or very authoritative settings wearing the proper garb for the situation. And finally, 4. You know that if you refuse, not only your life, but your entire family's lives would be massively at risk also. So within this situation, you cannot argue because you know what they're saying is true. The solution is extreme, but the emotions do not register, as these people know exactly how to appeal to your personality and feed your paranoia and/or ego more. Also, in some cases, they dehumanize and humiliate others that stand against them directly in front of you or even encourage you to take part. And to top all of that off, you see the visual appeal to authority with your own eyes. Now ask yourself that question. Now place yourself in the shoes of those who stated, "I was just doing my job. I was just following orders." Well, not Eichmann, but the foot soldiers. Not just from Nazi Germany either, but that of the soldiers guarding Unit 731 in Japan, or that of the peasantry of any historical tyrant or dictator. They aren't just dangling deadly consequences over your head. They are justifying atrocity through a number of means because that is how you take normal, everyday people who initially do not fit the bill of what we describe as evil go on to carry out the worst actions imaginable to their fellow human beings. Now I realize that was a very long-winded method of painting the picture required for this video, but I did want to do something a little more nuanced and profound prior to delving into this dark experiment. Now that I'm done attempting to give you all existential crises, let's actually give everyone existential crises by explaining what the Milgram study was, its results, and its major ethical red flags. So, as previously stated, the Milgram study, or rather shock study, was carried out in 1961 at Yale University. The goal was to find out how blind obedience and human inhumane behavior could be better understood, to provide a window into humanity's cruelty, to further understand how the German people could allow the attempted extermination of the Jews. Volunteers applied to take part in the experiment via newspaper ads and were asked to fill the roles of teachers and learners, 40 males in total. In actuality, the quote-unquote learner was actually an actor and was specifically trained for the role, but we will get to that in a moment. The teachers were monitored sometimes in a walled-off room where they could not see the actor playing the learner. Sometimes they could through one-way glass. Alongside them stood overwatching, every so often verbally stating one of 4 statements encouraging them to carry on, was the experimenter. The teacher would read words to the learner and the learner had to repeat back those same words or associated words. If the learner got the prompt wrong, the teacher was then encouraged to give them an electric shock. The voltage of the shock would increase by 15-volt increments, starting from a harmless 15 volts all the way up to a seriously life-threatening 450 volts. The learners would get enough wrong to exceed 300 volts in every single circumstance. The teachers fully understand the danger levels and the subsequent serious harm that they thought they were doing via the learners' acting skills. The learners would scream, beg to be let out, bang on walls, and even fake death in some circumstances. Despite the screams, the cries of pain, the authority figure stood behind the teacher would give one of 4 prompts over and over again, encouraging more shocks and a strong desire to continue the experiment. You must continue, and you have no other choice, or it's absolutely essential that you continue, or please continue, or please go on. Now, you have to understand that the volunteers were told that they would get paid for their time, $4.50 for simply just coming to the lab. At no point was it stated that they absolutely had to see the study through, as they believed it to be all the way through to the end. The learners were told prior to the initiation of the experiment that whilst the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent damage. Allow me to read a few lines from the actual study itself. The lesson administered by the subject was a paired associate learning task. The subject read a series of word pairs to the learner, and then read the first word of the pair along with 4 terms. The learner was to indicate which of the 4 terms had originally been paired with the first word. He communicated his answer by pressing one of 4 switches in front of him, which in turn lit up one of the 4 numbered quadrants in an answer box located atop the shock generator. The instrument panel consists of 30 lever switches set in a horizontal line. Each switch is clearly labeled with a voltage designation that ranges from 15 to 450 volts. There is a 15-volt increment from one switch to the next, going from left to right. In addition, the following verbal designations are clearly indicated for groups of 4 switches going from left to right: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock. 2 switches after this last designation are simply marked XXX. As previously mentioned, the experimenter would give verbal prods, one of 4 statements made as the teacher to encourage them to continue administering electric shocks, given in a sequence. If the 4th prod was refused, then the experiment was terminated. Now, before I give you the results of the first study in human social psychology, let me tell you that the 14 students at Yale who were asked a hypothetical question prior to the experiment, out of 100 potential subjects, could they predict their behavior? The students collectively agreed that 0 to only 3% of the students would reach the maximum of 450 volts. Of the 40 subjects, 26 of them obeyed all the way to the end. 1 reached 375 volts, 1 at 360, 1 at 345, 2 at 330, 3 at 315, and 5 at 300. Every single subject took the punish shock voltage to at least 300 volts. Now, I think it is best to read direct from the study again verbatim to explain how the subjects reacted throughout the experiment. With a few exceptions, subjects were convinced of the reality of the experimental situation, that they were administering shocks to another person, and that the most potent shocks were extremely painful. In the post-experimental interview, subjects were asked, how painful to the learner were the last few shocks that you administered to him? Subjects were instructed to indicate their answers on a printed 14-point scale ranging from not at all painful to extremely painful. The modal response was 14, extremely painful, and the mean at 3.42. Signs of extreme tension. Many subjects showed signs of nervousness in the experimental situation, and especially upon administering the most powerful shocks. In a large number of cases, the degree of tension reached extremes that are rarely seen in socio-psychological laboratory studies. Subjects were observed to sweat, tremble, stutter, bite their lips, groan, and dig their fingernails into their flesh. These were characteristic rather than exceptional responses to the experiment. One sign of tension was the regular occurrence of nervous laughing fits. 14 of the 40 subjects showed definite signs of nervous laughter and smiling. The laughter seemed entirely out of place, even bizarre. Full-blown uncontrollable seizures were observed for 3 subjects. On one occasion, we observed a seizure so violently convulsive that it was necessary to call a halt to the experiment. The subject, a 46-year-old encyclopedia salesman, was seriously embarrassed by his untoward and uncontrollable behavior. In the post-experimental interviews, subjects took pains to point out that they were not sadistic types, and that the laughter did not mean they enjoyed shocking the victim. It had been conjectured that persons would not in general agree to administer shocks beyond the level designated as very strong shock. The distribution of maximum shocks for this experiment is shown in Table 2. The obtained distribution scores deviates radically from the prediction. Upon command of the experimenter, each of the 40 subjects went beyond the expected break-off point. No subject stopped prior to administering shock level 20. At this level, 300 volts, the victim kicked on the wall and no longer provides answers to the teacher's multiple-choice questions. Of the 40 subjects, 5 refused to obey the experimental commands beyond the 300-volt level. 4 more subjects administered one further shock and then refused to go on. 2 broke off at the 330-volt level, and 1 each at 345, 360, and 375. Thus, a total of 14 subjects defied the experimenter. These results and the behaviors indicated throughout might indeed shock you, again, no pun intended. And as one might imagine, especially in the 1960s, the publishing of these findings were more than a little controversial. After all, they told of the darkness within humanity, and that we as humans who tend to follow social hierarchies, authorities, and our own moral compass, that actually up to 65% of us, if placed into Holocaust-like situations, might actually never question our orders. Of course, however, the study came under massive scrutiny, with a great deal of ethical questions being asked, along with skepticism. After all, the reaction throughout by the subjects indicates extreme levels of stress, as well as the fact that the study doesn't take situationalism into account. This was 1960s America, not 1930s or 40s Germany. Very different places, very different societies. And also, these were all men from varying backgrounds and a variety of career paths. Yes, concepts such as appeal to authority, and I'd even argue that obligation in itself were at play here. Yes, they were going to be paid regardless, but obligation is more than mere financial gain. Other than the simple, quote, trust the science, taking part in such an experiment, especially one as emotionally intense as this, surely must be for the greater good of humanity. We should also take into account that these were all men in 1960s America, all across the Western world, especially back then, would have likely grown up under the mantra, spare the rod, spare the child. And even if not, one can fairly assume that respect for authority is standard fare when raising children around this time. That, of course, brings me back around to social hierarchies. We may all stare and gawk at public outdoor crime scenes or even accidents, but we all know to not cross that police line, right? When driving, we all shift when we see a vehicle with blue lights behind us, don't we? Even on public transport, we abide by the keep to the right or keep to the left signs we see. So naturally, a man stood behind us, being firm but not rude, wearing a lab coat. Well, we're a lot more likely to listen to him, aren't we? We as humans also tend to want to work together to become part of groups to achieve an overstated goal. We also know that typically mistakes are always the fault of the leader. After all, the first rule of leadership is everything is your fault. The other factor, other than fundamental attribution bias, is the awkwardness, discomfort, and even anxiety that is often caused by disobeying orders, being put on the spot, taking a stand, and so on. Well, that's not always easy, is it? Standing up for yourself, your morals, what is right, it isn't always easy. But as one might imagine, other than the many skeptical points made by other professionals in the psychology field, there are questions of ethics. I have already read to you how many of the subjects reacted to hearing and sometimes even seeing the learner kick out, bang on walls, scream, complain of heart problems, and even apparently die. Well, according to the study, the actor and the subjects met under friendly terms afterwards, but the study doesn't say how long after the experiment they actually met. It is well known that some of the subjects believed they had legitimately killed the actor, and went up to 2 months after the experiment before finding out the truth. All this said, however, similar experiments have since taken place and have often replicated very similar results. That said, the results found back in 1961 at Yale do not thoroughly explain Nazi Germany or the Holocaust. There are many more attributes at play with such a scenario: moral psychology, external and internal bystanders, economics, political posturing and victimhood ideology, religious ideology, and so on. Not all necessarily together, but you get the gist. Milgram's study did prove something, however, that there is a combination of factors when thrown together that can influence moral, good people into harming another person. We all do possess the capacity for evil. 10 years later, in a similar, more infamous study, the Stanford prison experiment would yield even more profound results. But I would love to know what you all think of this, so please let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching. This was my first dark science video, and I would like to do more of them to keep the content varied and interesting here. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't. If you want to support me on Patreon or as a channel member, links are in the description. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Have a lovely day. Peace.